Hello, and thanks for joining me again today. I'm working on another entry in my 30-day landscape challenge. This one's going to be a little bit different. I'm using a photo that I found online on Unsplash, and it's of the Cornwall Coastline in the UK, and I'll put the link for the reference photo so that you can see the original photo that I was working from. My landscape challenge that I've been working on has been based on my Bob Ross calendar, my daily calendar that I received for Christmas, but I was wanting to try something a little bit different. And there's several YouTubers that I follow that do a lot of plein air painting, which is painting outside, and they just so happen to be located in the UK, and I really love the Cornwall landscapes and the Cornish coastline, and that's on one of the places that I'd love to visit that's on my bucket list. So I thought, I'm not going to wait. I'm just going to go ahead and try and do a painting myself. Even if it's not plein air, it gives me an opportunity to sort of see the location and study the landscape and look at the colors. And I'm using my Caran Neocolor 2 aquarels, which are a water-soluble wax pastel. You could call them a crayon. They look like crayons, and you can get a variety of different brands. Crayola even makes water-soluble crayons now. But I just did a really simple line drawing, and then I came back with just a round watercolor brush, and I'm just adding some clean water to some of the colors that I added. And I start with a really loose sketch, and then I fill in very lightly with some color. I like to layer my colors. I don't like to put down really heavy layers of color to begin with, because I really think of these as watercolor paint. And with watercolor paint, if you start too heavy, it's very difficult to layer and get a nice value if you start too dark originally. So I'm really just using some neutral colors. My colors are pretty bright, and they're probably brighter than the reality of what the landscape looks like, but I like to use brighter colors, and the Neocolors are pretty intense, and the colors are just beautiful. And if you've never used them before and you want to try them, you can get very small sets on Amazon with a limited palette that will give you a chance to play around with them. This set that I have is actually their full line of colors, and I had been looking at this for a very long time, several years, and it's not cheap. It was over $100, but I decided to splurge. I hadn't treated myself to any art supplies for quite a while, and so I splurged and got these, and I'm really enjoying using them. They're so fun to play with, and they're very forgiving. And if you put down too much color and you activate it with water and it's too heavy or too dark, you can very easily lift it with a paper towel. The paper that I'm using is a mixed media paper. I have tried a lot of different papers with the Caran Neocolors, and even though mixed media paper is not as thick as watercolor paper, and it does have a tendency to buckle if you use too much water, I like the smoothness of the paper, and I just feel like I get a little bit better results using this particular type of material. I do tape down the edges of my paper, and that helps with the buckling a bit. And I do want to invest in some really good smooth watercolor paper. Watercolor usually comes in two different varieties. It comes in hot press, which is smooth, and then there's cold press, which has a rough texture. And I've only ever really used the cold press paper, but I do want to give the hot press a try because I think it will work better with the crayons. It'll give me a little bit of a smoother application, and I think it'll give me the results that I want. But when I'm just playing around, I don't mind using the mixed media paper, and it's actually working out very well. So I just continue to fill in some color. I'm using some grays, I'm using some browns, and the greens that I'm using are pretty intense. They're pretty bright, but I haven't had this set for very long, and I haven't tried all the colors, so I'm really just trying to get a good idea of what other colors can do. And as I continue to layer and build, I am starting to use a little bit of a darker color. And if you notice, I do a lot of scribbling. I don't put a lot of color down. I'd like to add just a little bit and then add the water and move the color around. And I also really like the Caran for adding texture and adding some details after I finish the watercolor part of my painting. So the thing that was difficult with this particular painting was the grass is sort of growing along the cliffs, so this was a little bit challenging to get that effect, but you know, it's practice, and I'm seeing what kind of results I can get. Another reason why I wanted to try this particular landscape or coastline is because I live in South Florida. We have no cliffs, we have no hills, it's very flat, and we have palm trees, and it's beautiful here, but this is very different than the environment where I live, and I do paint a lot of the scenery down here, so I wanted to try something a little bit different and challenge myself. And this is definitely a challenge, but it's really fun, and I'm trying not to worry too much about making the details perfect. I'm just going with trying to give the impression of cliffs and the impression of a coastline, and just moving the color around and just trying to make it interesting and very expressive. At this point, I wanted to add a little bit more depth, and I wanted to add some highlights and some waves crashing along the rocks, and I knew I couldn't really do that with the crayon. The white crayon I really just use it more for blending. It doesn't really give me strong white highlights, so I'm using gouache paint, which is sort of in between an acrylic paint and a watercolor paint, and I'm just dabbing the white on the water and just adding a little bit of texture and kind of the idea of sea foam. Once I finished working on the water, I wanted to add a little bit of highlights to my cliffs, but I didn't want the white to be really strong, so I did dilute it a little bit with some water, and as you can see, I'm sort of layering it on, and then I'm picking it up a little bit with the paper towel, and I'm using a little bit of a dry brush technique where I just have very, very little water, and I'm just tapping my brush just to give the impression of some lighter values. I wanted to add some yellow flowers to the front of the landscape, and because yellow is a lighter color, again, it's difficult to layer, so I'm back to using my crayon, and I'm putting color down and I'm pressing hard because I want to have a lot of color being left on the painting, and I'm adding a little bit of orange over top just to give it some depth. And I do take some white gouache and I'm dabbing some of that white because I want the yellow to stand out a little bit more. And then I'm just going to come in with some green, and I'm going to add a little more green for the stems for the flowers, and then I'm coming back again over that white that I had added just to give a little bit lighter background so that the yellow and the orange might stand out a little bit more. I'm going to add a few minor details to the sky with some light blue, and I'm just going to add some to the cliffs as well, just for some repetition and some variation. Thank you so much for joining me as I created this really loose and expressive painting of the Cornish coastline. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe.